Scriptures in the 21st Century, Part 4, the Tower of Bavel and the current Middle East crisis. Today I want to explore how the current Middle East crisis has its origins at the Tower of Bavel, when 70 people groups were dispersed after Yahweh confused their language. This is yet again a very big subject, which is hard to break down into 30-minute segments. So there will be parts that, while important, will need to be skipped over to some extent. There may also be many questions that arise from what appear to be unanswered questions. But rest assured that most of those points will be considered in later episodes. Some other parts may even seem rather tedious and disconnected, but rest assured that they are all important and help to build a wider picture of what I'm sure is the root cause of the current Middle Eastern crisis. Having said all that, I want to go back to the end of the last week's episode and pick up where we left off, which was the time when we were leading up to the Flood of Noach. The particular relationship Yahweh had with Aram in Gan Eden came to an abrupt end when Aram ate the forbidden fruit and their bond of particularity was broken. Then, throughout the next 1656 years, Yahweh only had a universal relationship with human beings because of the ever-increasing violence and corruption upon the earth. Finally, Yahweh brought about the Flood of Noach, and by setting apart Noach and his family in the ark, they alone were spared with the rest of mankind, while the rest of mankind and all breathing creatures died in the flood. So the cycle of humanity began again. But still, Yahweh did not have a close relationship with any particular person. Even Noach, whom Yahweh had considered righteous in his own generation, did not have the same depth of relationship that Yahweh had had in the beginning with Adam. In Bereshit, Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, God blessed Noach and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply and fill the earth." That command was a direct reflection of what God had said in Bereshit chapter 1 verse 28, when he said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." But this time, the relationship between Yahweh and mankind was on a universal level. The second phase of human history was about to begin. However, this time, things were going to be different. Starting in chapter 9 verse 2, Yahweh said, "No longer would the animals and the birds be companions for humans as they had been with Adam in Gan Eden. Instead, they would become food for mankind." Having given mankind every kind of living creature as food alongside seed-bearing fruit and vegetation, Yahweh did place an important restriction on their eating of all animal flesh. Humans were never to eat blood of any creature. So definite was the command that in verse 5, Yahweh said, "I will certainly demand an accounting for the blood of your lives. I will demand it from every animal and from every human being. I will demand from every human being an accounting for the life of his fellow human being." The wording in that verse shows that Yahweh would demand an accounting from human beings if they ate the blood of animals. Therefore, in a rather obscure way, the verse shows that the animals would be in fear of man, and also animals, because of the meat-eating kinds, would be seeking after the grass-eating kind of animals as prey. Likewise, human beings would also become prone to attack by meat-eating animals. Therefore, in that same verse, if an animal killed a man, it too was to be killed as recompense for the death of a human. Further, if one human took the life of another, the life of the killer also had to be taken as a just redress for the first death. The whole structure was an early form of pre-Torah justice. Hence, in the midst of that violent world, Yahweh was demanding justice, which was a feature of life that had been missing before the flood. Accountability was to be applied to all living beings in response to their acts of violence. God then made a covenant with Noach and his sons, which would be passed down through all their generations, as God said, he would never again destroy all living beings through the flood of water. Having made a covenant, God then placed the rainbow in the clouds as a continual reminder the covenant would be passed down through every generation. Sometime later, Noach, having planted a vineyard, partook of the produce of his efforts, and it made him drunk. While lying uncovered in his tent, his son Ham and his grandson Kena'an saw their father and grandfather in a naked state, and possibly made disparaging remarks to their brothers Shem and Yefet, who together walked backwards into the tent and covered their father. Upon awakening, in verse 24, Noach knew what his youngest grandson had done to him. What had been done to him is not revealed. But in the next verse, Noach says, "Cursed be Caanan, Ham's youngest son. He will be a servant of servants to his brothers." Then Noach pronounces a blessing upon both Shem and Yefet, but qualifying that blessing by saying that Kena'an will be their servant. As we'll see, the curse that was placed upon Kena'an had far-reaching ramifications, not only for that generation, but every subsequent generation that followed. Those words have resulted in much abuse, particularly by the descendants of Yefet, who had taken many people from the descendants of Ham to be slaves over many centuries. However, at no stage did Noach ever place a curse on Ham. It was confined to Kena'an, Noah's grandson, who, as we will see later in Scripture, was the people group that Israel was to completely displace when they entered Eretz Israel. Chapter 9 ends by saying Noach lived 350 years after the flood, which meant he lived for a total of 950 years. Those words form the chronological link between the world before the flood and the new community that developed from Noach's 3 sons. So moving on to chapter 10, we see the genealogical list of all the descendants of Noach's 3 sons in the order of Yefet, Ham, and Shem. The whole of chapter 10 is devoted to providing the names of all the male descendants of those 3 sons of Noach, who were involved in the building of the Tower of Bavel. 14 from Yefet, 30 from Ham, and 26 from Shem. In their total, there were 70 men named. However, that number is spread over 5 generations, starting from Noah's 3 sons. The development of those 5 generations took 130 years, between the end of the flood and the building of the Tower of Bavel. Included among those present at Bavel would have been Noach himself, who lived for 350 years after that flood. But while he would have been present, he is not mentioned in the genealogical list. Therefore, we perhaps can assume that he had no part in the building of that tower. So where was the Tower of Bavel? Chapter 11, verse 2 says, "It came about that as they travelled from the east, They found a plain in the land of Caanan and lived there. Bible scholars have suggested many different locations for Bavel, but the general consensus is that most likely it was in the southern region of Mesopotamia. So accepting that the Ark of Noach grounded on Mount Ararat, in accordance with Bereshit chapter 8 verse 4, we find the distance between Mount Ararat and Shinar is approximately 700 kilometers. So going back to chapter 10, we're told Cush fathered Nimrod, who was the first powerful leader on the earth. His kingdom began with Bavel in the land of Shinar. As they were all descended from the three sons of Noach, and given the circumstances which they found themselves in, it makes good sense that there would have been a collective security in staying together. So in Bereshit chapter 11 verses 3 and 4 it says, "They said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and bake them in the fire.' So they had bricks for building stones and clay for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top reaching up into heaven, so that they could make a name for themselves and not be scattered all over the earth.'" Yahweh realized that as the community had followed the lead of Nimrod, that same rebellious practice that had occurred before the flood was emerging yet again in the new community. So even though Noach had possibly been a steadying influence in their midst, the majority of the community followed the lead of Nimrod, who had led the cry, "Come, let's build ourselves a city." As we read in chapter 11, verses 5 through 9, Yahweh went down, confounded their plans for building, and confused their language. As it is impossible to work constructively in the absence of common language, they gave up building the city and the tower and scattered in many directions. Immediately after the confusing of their languages, the community broke up and all three family groups went their separate ways. So back in chapter 10, verses 11 through 12, we're told, Asher, the second son of Shem, went out from the land and built the city of Nineveh. Next we see that Terach, the father of Avram, also moved his family away from Ur of the Chaldees and settled in Haran. There is no other list in Scripture that compares with chapter 10. It is the only one that gives us some indication about how the various tribal groups went out from the Tower of Bavel. It is agreed by most scholars that dispersion went in three separate directions based on the three sons of Noach. So without going into finer details, we see the broader pattern of dispersion occurred along the following lines. Yefet and his descendants went generally westward to the regions of Anatolia and the European regions north and west of Eretz Israel. As Greek mythology suggests, the descendants of Yefet became the ancestors of the Hellenistic people groups of Europe. Verse 5 mentions, from these islands the nations were divided into their lands, each according to the language and according to the families in their nations. The word islands appears to refer to the coastlands, which suggests that those families who travelled outward towards the western limits of the post-flood landmass went as far as they could towards the west. Ham, by contrast, and his descendants are represented as the father of the ancestor of various peoples in North Africa, around Egypt, and various parts of Arabia. Particularly in verses 15 through 19, it gives a detailed list of the names of the descendants of Kena'an and how they settled in what Yahweh later brought about to be Eretz Israel. Now moving on to Shem and his descendants, we see, starting with Asher, the second son of Shem, established himself in the region near the junction between the Kavar and the Euphrates rivers, in what is now eastern region of northern Syria. It is also considered to have been the place where Peleg, the fifth generation antecedent of Avraham, actually set up his residence. Many other sons of Shem migrated eastward towards Persia and beyond, while Peleg's brother, Yoktan, who had 13 sons, migrated to the regions between Mesha and Safar, which is considered to be down the Red Sea coast of the Arabian Peninsula. So we see that all three people groups migrated in three different directions and slowly populated the earth landmass. Having started off as just 70 people, 70 males with their wives, they were considered by the Jewish sages as having been the 70 nations of the world. Time alone, time along with many territorial wars and continuing splintering of groups, one after another, they partly because of overcrowding and partly because of their disputes. The original 70 people groups or nations have become over 195 individual sovereign nations. While these details seem unimportant, they will later feature strongly in our understanding of the current Middle Eastern crisis. Now, moving on into the latter part of chapter 11, we find another genealogical list, similar to the one in Bereshit chapter 5. In chapter 5, it detailed the lineage from Adam's family through Shet to Noach, where in chapter 11, it details the lineage from Shem to Terach, the father of Avraham. It was Terach who set out from Ur to go to Kena'an, but for some unexplained reason, he stopped at Haran, which is north of the Euphrates River, in the region now known, of course, as southeastern Turkey. It was at this point in history where Yahweh ended his dealings with the greater part of mankind. Having confused the languages of the 70 men who stood at the Tower of Bavel, Yahweh finally selected one man with whom he would have an everlasting relationship, a truly particular relationship. Up until the calling of Avram, Yahweh had dealt universally with the three people groups or nations, but now he was changing his approach to dealing with just one man. So Yahweh called Avram from Haran, as it says in chapter 12, verse 1 to 3, "Get yourself out of your country, away from your kinsmen, away from your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will become a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who curses you. And by you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Now that is a very powerful and far-reaching statement that Yahweh was making. But how does it relate to the world today in the 21st century? The selection of Avram and the promises made in chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, became the primary catalyst in what has become the continuing conflict in the Middle East. Turning back to Bereshit chapter 15, we find that in verse 7 through 21, Yahweh cutting a covenant as an eternal promise of the land inheritance. In verse 18, Yahweh said, "I have given this land to your descendants from the Vadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates." The covenant promise was made before Avram had even had a son who could carry on to forward that promise. But what we're seeing in the promise is all the territory from the Sinai Peninsula at the Vadi of Egypt right across the Arabian Peninsula northward to the Euphrates River. All that land was to become the rightful possession of Ishmael, Avram's firstborn son. But as we saw in the dispersion from Bavel, many of Ham's descendants had settled in various parts of that Arabian Peninsula. Further, the sons of Yoktan, who was the fourth generation son of Shem, along with his 13 sons, had also settled down the Red Sea coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Hence, when the promise was made to Avram that his descendants would inherit that land, there became an unending problem. Both the descendants of Ham and those of Yoktan, who had taken up residence in that area, became a problem to the Arab nations that descended from Ishmael. However, the mixed multitude appears to have coexisted in harmony until late in the 1800s, when the Ottoman Empire threatened to disband the Arab League. The Arabs then aligned themselves with the Allied forces in World War I to overthrow the Ottomans. However, instead of being re-established as a united Arab League, the new independent Arab Gulf states were formed, which in turn led to strong opposition towards both the British and the French governments, who had broken up the original Arab League. In parallel with the infighting that continued among the Arab states, the descendants of the ancient land occupied by both the Hamitic and Yoktanian descendants became a thorn in the flesh of the descendants of Ishmael, who had the rightful claim to their territory as promised to Avram. Concurrent with that internal conflict, the other crisis that developed in the region was the development of the modern state of Israel in the territory of ancient Canaan, which is the whole territory which was described in Bereshit chapter 10 verse 19. That same territory had been promised to Avraham following the birth of Yitzchak. In Bereshit chapter 17 verse 7 and 8, where Yahweh said, "I am establishing my covenant between me and you, along with your descendants after you, generation after generation, as an everlasting covenant, to be a God for you and for your descendants after you. I will give you and your descendants after you the land in which you are now a foreigner, all the land of the Kena'an as a permanent possession. I will be their God." Hence, when the modern state of Israel was established, the territory promised to Avraham became the focal point of conflict, and particularly the region of Judea and Samaria, which the Western world and the United Nations has renamed as the West Bank. Over the next 19 years, between 1948 and the Six-Day War of 1967, there was a constant struggle for the ownership of that disputed territory. So who were the refugees who were claiming rights of the disputed territories? They were the people groups who had been displaced and driven westward by the newly formed Arab Gulf states, particularly from the Kingdom of Jordan. As I said in the beginning, this is such a big subject, it is impossible to cover the whole period and consider all these people groups that are involved in just one episode. So I want to leave it at this point today, so that next week's episode, I can look more closely at how the descendants of both the sons of Ham and the sons of Yoktan, who migrated from the Tower of Bavel and settled in the territories promised by Yahweh exclusively to the descendants of Avraham through both Ishmael and Yitzchak, became a problem over land ownership, which has lasted right down to this day. In that episode, we will see how the present crisis situation has spread far beyond the Middle East because of the unwelcome interference by the Western nations of Yefet. What began as a united community standing against Yahweh, saying, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top reaching into heaven. That became the greatest global issue that is now pervading the 21st century. So that is why it is so important that we, as Talmudim of Yeshua, know and understand clearly what it means and how it relates to the sovereign plan of God. Until next week, Shabbat Shalom.